Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. It's wonderful that we can have a truly global conversation across multiple time zones so we can discuss Luc Tuymans' new body of work, Good Luck, opening at our Hong Kong gallery next Tuesday. I'm Angela Chun, Senior Partner at David Swerner. I've been based in London since 2012. And before that was in New York with the gallery since 1994. That's the year I first met Luc when he did his very first New York gallery show in the US titled Superstition. Let me introduce you to also Hans Ulrich. Thank you so much for joining us also from London today. As many of you know, Hans Ulrich is an art historian, critic and curator who's been artistic director of the Serpentine Galleries in London since 2006. Before that, he was curator at the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris. After organizing his first exhibition, World Soup, the kitchen show in his apartment in 1991, he's curated over 300 solo and group exhibitions all over the world. I first heard about his projects when Anquara told me about his legendary Hotel Carton Palace Chambre exhibitions in Paris in 1993, in which he invited 70 artists to exhibit in his hotel room. He has pursued ongoing initiatives such as Do It, a project that began also in 1993. He's expanded his practice outside of Europe to encompass increasingly global concerns. Hans Ulrich organized with critic and curator Hu Han Ru the groundbreaking and influential exhibition Cities on the Move, which traveled from Vienna to New York, Bordeaux, Denmark, London, and Helsinki from 1997 through 2000. He has since published interviews with contemporary Chinese artists in 2009, and the Chinese edition of The Future Will Be in 2012 with Philip Tenari. He continues to promote robust global ideas and exchanges in his curating, research, and writing. A tireless advocate for artists and the value of their ideas, he is known for his ongoing interview project, a project of probing insightful conversations with international artists and leading cultural figures. I know no better person to be here with us today to discuss Luc's work. Belgian artist Luc Tuymans was among the first artists to be represented by David Swerner after David saw his wonderful presentation in Jan Hoot's 1993 documenting Castle. I've had the privilege to work with Luc since 1994 and have had the great fortune to see many of his exhibitions, and he has had many. Good Luck is his 13th exhibition with the gallery and his first solo show in our Hong Kong gallery. It's fair to say that over the last 3 decades, Luc has earned his place as one of the most important painters of his generation. Few artists have been able to address everything from history to the state of contemporary global culture with such searing insight. Based on pre-existing imagery from historical, cultural, or everyday sources such as iPhone photos or YouTube videos, his restrained canvases belie their ability to address the realities of our world with a deep moral complexity. Luc's work has been featured in numerous solo exhibitions, including his critically acclaimed presentation at the Belgian Pavilion in Venice in 2001. He has had major exhibitions around the world, including Kunsthalle Bern, Renaissance Society Chicago, Tate Modern, Haus der Kunst, Munich, Wexner Center, Columbus, San Francisco MoMA, Dallas Museum, MoCA Chicago, Beaux-Arts, Qatar, and also Palazzo Grassi in Venice last year, to name but a few. Without further ado, thank you so much, both of you, for joining us today, and let's get started.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela. Thank you so much, Luc. It's a great pleasure and privilege today to be in conversation with Luc Tuymans. And actually, we met with Luc in 1993 for the first time, and Caspar Koenig and I organized the exhibition, The Broken Mirror. And it was the same year that we actually recorded our first conversation, which was recently found again for Museum in Progress, as part of this Peter Korda series of video interviews. Today, we're going to talk about the exhibition, Good Luck. We're also going to talk about the lockdown, the work you created during the lockdown. We're going to talk about your very long relationship to China. But before all of that, I wanted to actually begin with the beginning and wanted to ask you how it all began, how you came to art. Because you once mentioned to me that one of the very earliest work was actually a color pencil drawing of a metal truck, which you did as a child at school.
Yes. Well, as a kid, I was kind of very silent, and in a way, I drew a lot. So I made a lot of drawings. And this was sort of like perceived by a lot of people around me as something that I could do. Now, the very first thing is not really the drawing of the garbage truck, but was actually when I was 6. And my mother was Dutch, and I spent a lot of holidays in Holland. And there were these camps, you know, for kids where you had to do sports and everything. And one of these things that we had to do one day, it was a little bit like the Tour de France, you know, every day you could win the yellow sort of sweater for your group. And there was one thing on a big square, and they distributed chalk amongst about 150 kids. And I actually made a drawing of a knight. I still remember that. And so I won the first prize with that from my group. So I had to come on the podium and put on the yellow sweater. And I said, this is probably the way I'm going to be accepted. So this is actually where it actually comes from. The drawing with the garbage truck was something that was really fascinating to me because I saw it. And we had to make a drawing about, the summer holidays. And it had to do with it. So I actually made a drawing of this truck already a little bit in perspective and with color pencils. And I was amazed by this metal truck and the metal garbage cans and the aprons. And the teacher that was in the 3rd grade, I think, was also somebody who had like artistic ambitions and didn't believe that I made this drawing. So I had to come to the blackboard and do it again with chalk. And I did it again and again put my big vacation underneath, which was kind of cynical, but I of course didn't know that because for me it was true. So that was the first sort of assessment that I was getting a sort of knowledge about the fact that I could do something with that. Of course, becoming an artist is something that came much, much later in a way. So.
And we talked about that moment of you becoming an artist actually in this interview in '93. I looked again at the video this week, and you told me in this interview that you began to paint very intuitively and that there was from the very beginning an existential drive, so to speak. You also explained that you actually destroyed most of your earliest work. So I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about those works, which were in big parts destroyed.
Well, the destruction is not, because you mentioned the idea as a destruction as a sort of concept within it. That's not completely true. It was also much more pragmatic. It was in the sense that I needed the canvas to actually continue to paint. And since I didn't have a lot of money at that point, the only thing that I could do was like to progress and actually overpaint the canvas that I had. And I actually destroyed a lot of things that I probably shouldn't have destroyed either. I mean, so there's still existing photographs that some of it we were able to retrieve for the first catalog raisonné and just put it there as a sort of idea. But when I started to paint and try to continue with painting, of course, painting was kind of seen as an antique. It was rather problematized in the whole education we got to that point. So in that sense, I was trying to perceive an idea to still continue to work with it. And that was a little bit infantile, but I had an idea which I call the authentic forgery. It's like I tried to make imagery that could have been perceived way before, in a sense. So the idea of the belatedness of painting was a concept from the start. And also putting the numbers on it, on which we will talk, which were actually things that I cut out of a sort of like tore off calendar, which I then actually cut out the numbers and glued them with paint on the surface of the thing that I painted as the only reality. So there was already this idea of dealing with how you could reconstitute a sort of significance to painting as a medium.
We'll talk about the numbers later. It's so interesting to hear you speak about these beginnings because actually during the lockdown, the numbers came back. But yeah, when we talked ahead of our conversation actually today, you told me on the phone that the beginning of the lockdown in Belgium meant that you couldn't go to your studio for a long time. And I was wondering if you can share a little bit how you experienced this as an artist, to actually be unable to go to your place of work, and how your work and your way of working has been influenced by this experience over the last couple of months. Because of course it also meant that you returned to animation, for example.
Yeah, well, first of all, the animation thing is something I started up already a little bit before that. But first I have to say, of course, as an artist, you even in a difficult situation like this situation, the lockdown, you always figure out a way to continue to work. I mean, it's also kind of a mental situation. I mean, it goes 24/24. And since it was problematic, I decided to work from home and also to work with a medium which just works on paper, which is much more feasible and easier to do in a smaller space also. But then I also got the idea to do this, to go back to this animation. And I made about 4 or 5. One of them actually ended up in the show in Hong Kong. And it's a whole project that is called Seconds, and it's mostly about the interest of making the image move. It goes back to a very old fascination with animation, because I think the very first time I saw Walt Disney Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, I was completely shocked when I saw that film in the film theaters, because for me it was like a horror movie. It was like I couldn't imagine how, as a kid, being 7 years old, that things could possibly move as in a real setting or in reality. So that's a fascination that stayed with me. And this whole project is called Seconds, that is also the show at Frank's is called Seconds, is about this idea of how things can be obliterated very fast, but it's also about nearly a sculptural 3D element to make these images move. And to do it by hand is also kind of compulsive. So this was a real great solution for this lockdown.
Also, actually, the animation, as you said, appeared already earlier. And already in 2004, you worked with animation. And there is a story of an epiphany, actually, you had in a railway station in Brussels. And then you phoned Kerry James Marshall, wanting to collaborate actually with Kerry James Marshall on an animation project, which remained unrealized. Can you tell us what happened in this railway station and then subsequently the call with Kerry James Marshall?
Well, I knew Kerry already for a while by then, and I mean, I got to know Kerry through my wife, actually, Carla Rocha, who actually was staged by him. And of course, I really respect Kerry's work, but I also knew that we both had this sort of infatuation with animation. And so I thought at that point, it was around 5 o'clock, I think, in Brussels North, I had this idea, why wouldn't we make an animation in black and white? Like also the thing, like to go back to the craft of making that. And he was very apprehensive to that idea. He actually came over to Belgium. We started up the whole idea of doing it. We also were pretty much in tune of making this animation ourselves, which needs manual. But of course, due time, it was, I mean, we were getting very overcharged. I mean, there was a lot of work, and in a sense, it was a little bit put on the back burner, which doesn't mean that it will not come to a collaboration later on, I don't know, but this is one of the unrealized projects. Yeah.
And of course, there are the realized one, and actually one is in the exhibition in Hong Kong. I wanted to ask you, tell us a little bit more about this, because they are actually made from drawings, from hand drawings, which you made during the lockdown. And I want to ask you particularly to tell us about the one with the owl, because it's a looped series of images of an owl which flies towards the viewer. And I read an interview you gave actually just very recently to T Magazine, where you say that the owl has a way of moving through space that you can't hear. So before you know it, it's too late. Can you tell us a little bit about this piece?
Well, first of all, the owl is, of course, kind of an enigmatic animal in a sense, because it stands for knowledge in the West, but it also has an apprehension of the idea of death. I mean, it has different complicated meanings as well here as actually also in China. And but on the other hand, there is also the element of On the other hand, there's also the element that the owl flies in a specific way that you can't hear it. It doesn't make any sound. So that makes it also like the perfect predator. So with all these connotations and this ambiguity around the animal, I think it was an interesting idea to do that. I mean, we can't really see it move now on the screen. You would just see a couple of stills of it. But if you see it move, it actually comes towards the spectator, which is an element of threat on the one hand. And on the other hand, it's also like an element that has to be perceived in complete silence. And I think that was the most interesting point. I mean, because also my work is work that actually does not interfere with the idea of sound or music. And I also had this sort of, from way back, actually, this fascination with silent movies in the sense.
You also said that it's basically a remark on living, how fast things can change.
Yeah,
and then the connection to Goya, because of course there is a famous all in the 1799 etching, The Sleep of Reasons, in Sueño de la Razón produce monstruos. The sleep of reason produces monsters. Can you tell us a little bit about that, about how it connects to this idea also of change?
As I said, the owl is something that comes back a lot. I mean, it comes back a lot with Casper, David's Friedrich, and completely related much more to cemeteries and the idea of an afterlife or not. And as I said, it can have sort of severe connotations in terms of a premonition of danger in a way, as it can also be the idea of knowledge, as I said. So this ambiguity of the fact that also the heads can turn 360 degrees, which is kind of scanning the whole situation like nearly a panopticon in a sense. So it is an animal with a sort of diverse qualities that remain mostly also kind of mysterious, which I think is why also in art and also especially with Goya, it actually goes into this idea of a certain mindset of what could happen and what could not happen, an element of premonition that plays out within the sort of mythological proposition of the bird itself.
Now, the owl is one of the most recent works in the exhibition. As Sue Wei describes in this very fascinating new text on your work, the oldest one is a portrait of Sun Yat-sen from 1980, where you were basically painting this image, this blurry image, actually against a very carefully rendered background. So very early in your work, there is this connection to China. Can you tell us about the genesis of this painting and how you came to make this portrait of Sun Yat-sen in 1980?
Well, it came about quite, it was not such a much a deliberate portrait, but it was about this fascination of China itself, you know, as a different scale, as a different proposition, and as a big blank, as an unknown in a sense. And therefore I actually painted this portrait, which is in a way blurred, but also rather stylized. If you look at it in a sense, it's within the features. Everything is sort of nearly going back to a drawn capacity. But then there is also the light of the yellow light that you see on the face in the gray. I also wanted to do it in a tone that remembers much more the idea of a document than something real, in a sense. Which is something which was already a premonition for what I would do later. In that way, it's kind of an important painting in a sense. But it deals with the assessment of the idea of how things can change and how also this idea of the official image could be actually portrayed in a way that it has an element of vulnerability in a sense. And this is why this was so fascinating for me to make.
Now, also, I actually remembered this morning suddenly a conversation we had at Caroline Bourgeois' birthday. Caroline, who curated your retrospective at Palazzo Grassi a few years ago in Venice. And at her birthday party last year, we had a long conversation on literature and your deep connection to literature. And I took actually a lot of notes that night and ordered a lot of books afterwards, a lot of Belgian writers, I wasn't familiar with it. Particularly, you told me one story which connects in a way to this early connection to China, which is actually when you were a teenager in your mid-teens, you read the poet and novelist Jan Jacob Stauerhoff, who became very influential on your thinking, particularly the book, The Forbidden City. Can you tell us about this book and why it kind of made this urgent, wishing you to travel to China at the time?
Well, the first thing is that I read these books when I was about 15 years in collision with two other ones, which was the Ethics of Spinoza, which is something completely different, and Esthétique des Vorscheins of Ernst Bloch. And the book that I read actually was not The Forbidden City, but it was Life on Earth with the subtitle, Such is Life in China. And it was an amazing shock to me because at that point, it was also the point that I broke with most of my friends, not because they were bad friends, but because we didn't have anything to say to each other anymore. So in terms of content, there was a sort of lapse. And I decided to break with all my friends, which I said were good friends, in order to create a different space. But that was a space where I isolated myself. It was also my puberty. So in that sense, it was in that sense quite existential. Now, this specific writer is a writer which is actually developed in the, I think, the 20s or 30s, he developed, it's one of the predecessors of the Nouveau Roman, which, and the interesting point about Slauerhoff is that he was actually a naval doctor that actually worked for the Java, China, Japan line, and in that sense actually was able to visit China, not only China, Mexico, South America, and all that, and wrote these stories at different places in a sense. So there is this conglomerate of all these elements that come together. And there is an element of an existential element because it actually departs from the main figure, which basically is to be drawn back to the writer and the poet, Jan Jacobus Slauerhoff himself. But what's more interesting is that by reading the book, which I read in one afternoon, it was going like through, I read it in one blow. It was like going into a different scale, into a different time zone, which I thought was rather interesting. And I still to this day think it's interesting because he actually also learned Chinese. He translated a lot of classical Chinese poetry. And it would be interesting as a project, and I once proposed it, to actually translate this specific book, if we get it through censorship, in China. It would be in Chinese. It would be interesting to see how that would correlate, because it's of course an idea of the 30s. But what's most important with what I got out of this particular book, and in a more global sense, is that actually Slauerhoff made the point that he died very young, he was 34, that at the point when he was dying, he made one sort of like very prophetic statement, which was that according to him, the world had sort of narrowed itself down in distances, but has become psychologically extremely big. And I think that is what comes out of the book. And that in correlation with the whole rationale of the ethics of Spinoza, which is one of the last philosophical structures that mathematically works and then was discarded by Kant. And of course also the philosopher of the possibilities with and then especially in the cultural realm of Ernst Bloch, those three things consistent as one piece of my brain in a sense at that point.
Now, talking about Hong Kong and China and your relationship also to the past, I mean, it's interesting thinking that the future is often invented with fragments from the past, and you've connected actually a lot also to history, not only in the work, but also as a curator. And that's something we discussed already when we met in the 90s, you're interested in curating. And I think it's important always when we think about the history of curating, that many relevant shows are actually curated by artists themselves. We look at 20th century, Duchamp's Surrealist exhibition, the Dada Messe. Many exhibitions are curated by artists themselves, and you've curated a lot in Belgium, but a lot also internationally. And I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about the show you did with Yu Hui called The Forbidden Empire, where you did a very big exhibition actually on large-scale exhibition really on Flemish and Chinese art.
Yeah, well, that was an exhibition that was actually proposed to me, and also Paul Jardin was running still running actually the Palais de Beaux-Arts, and it was the demand there was a female ambassador to Belgium to make a show about Rubens, which was impossible at that point. And then Pearl contacted me, and I came up with the idea to make a show from artwork starting from the 15th century in the lowlands, because actually the Netherlands in a sense, because Belgium didn't exist at that point, and in correlation with old Chinese masters, which was something that was unprecedented, what never happened before. And it was a very interesting process doing that because of all the prejudice that exists between the two cultures, and to bring them in this sort of open dialogue. And we did that in a very good way, I think. And my relationship with Liu Wei was also very, very interesting because he was a scholar also from the Palace Museum in the Forbidden City. And you immediately could see enormous differences. But nevertheless, we kept on to this timeline. And as I said, this was a very new project for both of us, I think. And it was interesting. In the Forbidden City, it was not shown the same way. It was shown in separate spaces. But nevertheless, this input stayed in the show. And I think this had a sort of small historical momentum.
And I'm talking about the past, the present, the future. That brings us also to the Shenzhen painting from 2019, where we see an aerial view of the city of Shenzhen, which you actually painted from a digital image, I think you found online. And then there is the fast forward, the rewind, the play button. Can you tell us about the genesis of this painting?
Well, it was also the point to make a link with imagery, and also a link that's in the vicinity, because actually Shenzhen is right next to Hong Kong and it's part of China mainland. And it's also the sort of, the Silicon Valley, the city, same as the Silicon Valley. It's there where most of the high tech is produced. It was also one of the first cities that was actually came about in the whole leap forwards idea of China itself, and now is there. And what I wanted to do was also make a reminiscence to a painting that I made before, which is actually a painting I made in 2004, when I for the first time went to China and was in Shanghai. And through one of the rings of the bridge on the other side of the Bund, I could see the image of the new Shanghai. And both images actually, on the one hand, emphasize about the element of the novelty, and it's also, of course, an element of power, but on the other hand, it's also an element of nostalgia that creeps into the imagery at the same time. And therefore, the fast forward and the idea to stop motion the image was an important thing to do.
Next to it is another painting called Cell from 2019. That's an image from Berlin from the 30s. Can you tell us about that? It again connects to history.
Yeah, that's an image that's a bit more, it's more abstract in a sense. And what really interested me in this particular image is the idea of how the light works on the surface, but especially because the cell door, it's a cell door out of Germany in the 20s, 30s, I think. And it doesn't have one, but mostly the cell door has one sort of eye through which you can actually look from the outside into the inside. But here it has two eyes, I mean, two openings to look through. I found that kind of interesting because it sort of personalizes the image at the same time, but at the same time gives it a different dynamic. And then, then this I think is the lock of the door, I think. So, and it's also painted on the verge of, because this show I also wanted to do in a way, I mean, there are things that relate directly to China, but I also was very well aware that last year a lot of Chinese people could have seen my show in the Palazzo Grassi. And on the other hand, I wanted to, since it's the first show in China ever, I wanted to make it as diverse as possible and to have different ways to look at the work, different ways how you apply the paint, but also different mindsets toward painting. And this is verging on the idea between the idea of abstraction and figuration in a sense, and works, but at the same time, it's an image of incarceration.
And then there is also the question about the local and the global I wanted to ask you, and maybe we could sort of talk about that in relation to the Delft painting, to the triptych, because Edouard Glissant, with whom I spoke a lot during the years when I lived in Paris, he said, you know, on the one hand, we're living in a world of globalization, but this is of course not the first time there is globalization. In previous centuries, there have been other moments of globalization, but he said it's in many ways the most violent moment of globalization, fueled by technology, and that leads to homogenization, to what Elizabeth Kolber calls the extinction, basically, crisis, the mass, you know, the sixth extinction. So he said we need to resist this homogenized globalization. At the same time, he says we have these new localisms in the world. We also need to resist new nationalisms, new localisms, which refuse the global dialogue, something which has actually been exacerbated through this COVID crisis. There have been so many more, you know, nationalistic moments. And so Glissant's point is more relevant than ever. He said we need to resist the homogenized globalization. We need to resist the counter reaction, or as Bernard Stiegler said, we need to ask ourselves, how can we be local without being localist? And it seems very interesting that with this Delft piece, it has a lot to do with the local, the global.
Yeah, because it's kind of an ironic piece about, in a sense, also. This was the very starting point of the show in Hong Kong, because I needed a way to get into the situation. And I remembered some photographs I took with my iPhone in a big house in Amsterdam, which was in the kitchen and where you had these Delft tiles. Now, these Delft tiles were important because, I mean, this whole procedure goes back to the 17th century, where the Dutch were a world power, although a very small country. And they were the first who were enabled to trade with the East, not only with Japan, but not only with Japan, also with China. And in that sense, they actually acquired a monopoly of actually distributing this high quality porcelain and this specific blue into the Western world. Now, when the emperor of the Ming dynasty died, they lost the monopoly. And strangely enough, at that point, and this is where the local and the global makes an insurgent already in the 17th century, there was a guy, an Italian guy in Antwerp, which is my hometown, which at that point was also, on the global terms, the biggest port in the then known Western world. And he actually developed a procedure to start to inquest it and made a process which is kind of similar, but different, but came close to this idea of producing porcelain, which is kind of still a rather unknown and very expensive artifact in the West, and the specific blue, which was then stolen by the Dutch and actually re-exported to China back, which is kind of an interesting irony of departure in the sense that when we think about China, we think a lot about made in China, which means material that's been made very fast and has kind of a low quality, and here this was the other way around. So I thought this was a kind of interesting element to start this show, which is also element, the specificality between, on a global level, between trade and culture, which I think is an interesting anthem to start from.
Thank you so much. Now, the exhibition, like always, have actually a title. It's an interesting conversation, actually, you once had with Lynn Cook, where you talk about the importance of giving these exhibitions titles. Yeah. The title is Good Luck. Can you tell us about the title of this new exhibition?
Well, the title is, of course, yeah, it's meant as it is meant, good luck, because of course you need luck in life. On the other hand, of course, there's a certain irony in good luck also, in a sense, because it can go both ways. But it's rather open-ended in its meaning, and you can attribute the meaning to it yourself, in a sense. I think that is the most important thing of the title. Now, titles are very important, and I also give most of my works titles, which I started to do from the very beginning, because when I did that, that was actually not done. But I did it because also a word can turn into a different signifier, can actually turn into a different image that's maybe even not there, but can be an addition to what you actually visually see. So the title works a little bit in that same way. And it's also important to know that when I make gallery shows, and this already started from the very beginning, the very first show was, of course, a choice out of 150 paintings which were in my back, out of which I picked 15. But from then on, from the second show on, and I did about 150 shows now, I think every gallery show, for example, had to be a construct as a whole. I mean, I don't work on paintings like 2 or 3 paintings at the same time, only one painting at a time. But nevertheless, when I make a show, and when I conceptualize a show, it has to be one thing also. I mean, so this is where also the titles become a subservient element towards the situation.
And one thing we haven't talked about is, of course, the process. You've just given this really fascinating interview with the magazine about the process also of painting. It's a Q&A, and you talk about precision and timing, but you also say that there is actually a moment which is for you the most horrible time, which is when you've got to figure out what you're going to paint. And once you've figured it out, it sounds less complicated. You then just do it. Can you tell us a little bit about this process, from how you deal with timing, with precision, how you experience what you call this horrible time to figure it out, and how you then do it?
Well, the horror of that is actually that I have to find a signifier. I mean, I cannot paint something that is not relevant to me, so it has to be relevant to me. This can be different things. I mean, it can also consist out of things that I don't understand. When an image is so mysterious and so ununderstandable, I probably will have to make it. But most of the time I try to find a reason why the image, and since I work with a lot of pre-existing imagery, it for me is very important to know what the image is about, what it signifies, what it means, and then actually to alter that meaning in a sense by appropriate it in the sense that it also means something to me. So that is a very, very painstakingly work. I mean, it takes a long time because a lot of things might seem relevant, but are not. And sometimes you also even oversee it because the most relevant thing could be in very close vicinity. So this is a whole process of trying to actually convince myself to create a visual, which I think is, I mean, for most artists is probably a genuine thing. But in this sense, this is the hardest thing, the way to conceptualize him. Once I have the imagery and assembled I mean, this is how it goes mostly with the show. When I have assembled all the imagery, which takes a long time, it goes through the whole process of making drawings of it, or trying to, with computer, change it, or with every sort of medium, or Polaroids in the old days, or the iPhone right now. So then to create this imagery, to formulate it, analyze it to that, and then I can actually paint it. Because when I start to paint, I don't want to think anymore. I want to have the idea that you have different types of intelligence. You have the brain, but you also have your hands. And at the point when I wanted to start to paint, and this is what I mean with timing and precision when it comes to the practice of painting itself, it has to be precise, it has to be intentional, and therefore I also work probably within the time slot of a day, and therefore at that point the brain shifts to the hands, which is a different intelligence, which is something I cannot completely control, because there are always things that actually change in that whole process.
And when do you know that a painting is finished?
Well, I learned it the hard way. I mean, I still remember that when I was very young, I was about 17 or 18. I actually won a prize with that specific painting, which was a self-portrait. And I was in a train back with an Interrail card, I think, from Greece. And I closed my eyes and I saw this portrait, which was a self-portrait, which I then actually painted when I got home without a mirror. And I painted it in 15 minutes, and it was actually fantastic. But I couldn't believe that you could make a painting in 15 minutes. So I actually destroyed it. And it took me about 3 months every day to get close to the initial attempt of the initial painting. So it took me a while to understand that you have to be very precise, to not go over it, to not overwork a painting, to not kill it in a sense. And this, till this day, is always a very sort of, it's a tremendous step you have to make. And every painting, of course, is different, but by now, I think there is a sort of ability to take a step back, and in a sense, you also have to see that you have, once you've done enough to something, when you come to your limits, you have to actually accept them.
Now, I thought, because we talked about the past, we talked about the present, we talked about the work you've just done, the just past. I thought it would be interesting to talk a little bit about what's about to happen right now in the studio, and also the future. Now, one thing which gave us a hint on that was your contribution to the Art Forum issue, where David Velasco invited you to participate in this issue, which came out during the lockdown. And it's actually for this issue that you revisited this very early work with the numbers you described. When you told us about these very early works you described, where you glued actually numbers on the surfaces of paintings, and you kind of saw these numbers as a reality that contrasted with the fictional reality of the painting. And now it's fascinating that you came back actually to these numbers. You've also done new paintings, which I think are going to be shown next year, and you've described these works as a global imagery for within a global crisis, an imagery that should be reduced and abstracted. And this is where you then thought of the numbers. So I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about numbers, because of course we've also, had so many, such a presence of numbers through the numbers of death, the tragic deaths with COVID, the numbers of infections. I wanted to ask you to tell us about these new works and how they relate actually to these very early work of yours.
Well, they related to the early works in the sense that I saw them as the greatest abstraction, in the sense that they can mean, in the early works, I would actually go from 1 to 10 and start again. I mean, so I just take the sort of basic elements of the numbers. Now, in accordance to this, how this came about, it's actually, this was something I would have painted also without the COVID crisis, but this was a decisive moment to make the decision, I think, and also to paint them. Of course, these are actually gouaches, but they have now been painted in oil paints and larger, very large oil paintings. And they also refer back to, I used them to make sections in the Super 8 films that I made, to organize them from 1 to 10, and actually filmed these numbers, and they have a specific light that comes better off from the oil paintings than in what you see right now. And when I was asked to do this project for Art From, I was asked to make a drawing of the virus, and I didn't thought that was an interesting idea. So I came to this idea to make something in a global crisis, which is really global, which can be perceived universally in a sense, and at the same time can be ambiguous in what it actually means, and actually has this ultimate abstraction, which I think is kind of interesting. And on the other hand, it can have all the other signifiers. I mean, it's also the way how you count up or how you retract numbers. It's also the idea of quantity in a sense, or how you quantify elements. And I think these things made it all the more relevant to make it right now.
You also said that they relate.
There's also the thing that by making these paintings, because I mean, this is something you cannot see on the screen, and actually you can also not see it when you would photograph the paintings and show that. The very strange thing is that once you're in between the physical space with the physical paintings, they become very sculptural. And I also had a very long-standing relationship or fascination with, let's say, the Rothko Chapel, for that matter. This idea of a nearly mausoleum-like space. And in the show in Antwerp, it would also be correlated with another animation, which is complete opposite of what these paintings then mean, but sort of gives it even a different meaning. And I think these things about creating this timeless time zone, but at the same time, you have this idea of stability, which I also was looking for in my old paintings. You know, this was the only thing that would be stable, that would be something like a consensus about the image. And this is the same thing here.
And you said also in our phone call the other day that they relate to your 92 series, the Diagnostische Blick, the diagnostic view, and the painting Bloodstains from 93, which of course fascinated me because these were the work you were actually doing when we met in 92, preparing the Broken Mirror exhibition we curated with Caspar Koenig in the Kunsthalle Vienna and then in the Deichtorhallen.
Yeah, these were the paintings that actually, some of them were shown in the show also, yeah. Like especially the diagnostic view number 4, which is the one with the blue eyes, which I don't think we have an image of it. The one with the bloodstains part, this is a breast of a cancer patient, and this is actually skin cancer, I think. The idea was interesting at that point because it was actually like missing the real. I mean, these are one of the more naturalistic paintings I ever made. But by doing that in a way, and also the fact at that point, the way I applied the paint to the canvas changed. It became horizontal in order that it became flattened out and it worked like a grid that you could not feel any empathy to what you were looking at. So this element of the object always fascinated me. Anyway, science and especially medical science was always an interesting input. And this whole series came about just by a conversation, because I had my show in the Kunsthalle in Bern, and I wanted to paint portraits again, but not the psychological portrait. And I actually came into contact with a psychoanalyst and asked him if they still produce these medical books for students from which they photograph a subject, and from that photograph, they had to derive a sort of diagnostic. And he sent me this book, and this is how actually the whole situation started, putting it back into the idea of the object, in a sense, to make an element of detachment. And it was also a sort of reminiscence to the whole film experience, you know. So this is where the close-up is important, where those things actually come into game, and it actually allowed me to proceed in that way.
And I remember actually when we showed these paintings in 93, in this conversation we recorded for Museum in Progress, I asked you about Gerhard Richter and about photo painting, because I was at that time starting to edit the book of the collected writings of Gerhard Richter and researching a lot the idea of photo painting. And you told me at that time that for you it was really more film and TV. than photography, which was important. You said that your generation grew up with TV as a normality and a new medium that became the everyday, as opposed to the generation of Gerhard, who grew up with photography. And I thought it was interesting if you can talk a little bit about that, because you said, I mean, these numbers came out of your early films, and there was a moment when you actually, in your early work, focused on film.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that, because I also remember that in the interview that I spoke in German about the idea of whenever you go to a movie, you try to recap with one image the sort of narrative of the movie, whereas with a painting you do the opposite direction in a sense. And what was interesting for me, and still is to a point, because there's a big resemblance between film and painting, a bit more actually than photography and painting for me. Because what's interesting is I would be actually a very bad photographer. I would be actually too late. The photographer is in the moment. I would be too late. My process is also a belated process of introspection with the visual. And with a film camera, even with a Super 8 camera, I could edit in the lens. And this is an interesting thing because both are about the idea of approach. And the approach is actually similar in a sense. Therefore, it's very difficult to combine painting as a medium together with painting, with film at the same time, because there is also a difference, but a big similarity in this idea of grasping and approaching the image. And I think, because I mean, you can also overpaint the painting, you can re-edit a film. So in that sense, I thought it was kind of interesting also the idea to mute the image, the idea to sort of pause the image. Those are things which were very interesting and different in terms of what photography actually does in a sense. There's also the idea of light, which is kind of important in this whole situation, the way how it differs and how it changes. And I still remember, you know, when I won the Max Beckmann Professor Prize in the Stedel, I was asked actually to do lectures and work with the academy students, but also to make a show and to make a choice out of the entire collection of the museum. But I was also asked to put 2 paintings of mine and I put them in a specific space in the museum. And I picked the space of the 19th century because there's a beautiful painting of Fernand Knopf that I remembered the first time I went to the Stedel, and I think Max Liebermann. And at that point, I painted a diptych called Against the Day. I think this was 2008, and one was in China in the show. This was the first painting I ever showed in China mainland in a group show called Involved. And the other one I actually showed in this space, this museum space in the Stedel. And although the picture just shows a guy spitting around in my garden, which have been, he could have fitted easily into the. But when I then put it there, I could see that it was a completely different light. It was digital light. It was the contrast was completely different. So this gives you an idea how you cannot get away from your contemporarity. It's impossible. It will always creep in to the visual. And I thought that was kind of mind-blowing to see that.
Now you mentioned the aspect of sound, and of course there is no soundscape actually to your animations, but there is also no soundscape in the studio when you paint. Dan Graham once told me one should always ask an artist what music they are listening to when they work, and you actually told me that there is silence in your studio. Can you talk a little bit about silence, the fact that there is no soundscape in the animation, the fact that you also don't have any sound in the studio when you paint?
Yeah, I mean, not that I have anything against music. I mean, my mother used to play the piano fantastically, so but I never bought a record in my life. So but it's and I don't. The importance of music is of course immense, but in my practice, I actually prefer not to have it. I mean, just as a sort of respect between the visual and the sound, I make the distinction. It's just a question of respect. It's a question of making a sort of decision in that sense, not to mingle them. I also had a big problem with a lot of art that actually derives itself from music in a sense, because it's not, I mean, personally, it's not my thing. And I think this silence is therefore a silence which is very full. It's not just a silence that is empty. It's a silence that becomes for or after something which produces itself. And that is what the main attention span is about. It's like you get maybe deaf temporarily in a sense, and that also focuses your sight in a different way. So it's again this idea of the intention in a way, and actually attention span.
Thank you so much. So I think we've covered most of the questions. There was actually one thing I wanted to ask you, which we never really discussed in our previous conversations, which goes beyond, you know, the exhibition. I sort of was interested in public art. For example, in your exhibition, of course, in Palazzo Grassi, you created this very big mosaic. And I was interested in this idea, you know, of public art, of going also beyond the museum. You work also with wall paintings sometimes. And of course, you know, looking at the current, you know, discussion about, because actually Helen Levitt, when I met her in the 90s, she said we should never forget, you know, what had happened in the 30s in the US with these, with the New Deal and with all these extraordinary public art projects the government had. And I think in the current moment of crisis, it's important again to think about that and, you know, what could be a new Deal. And so I read a lot about these public art schemes, or actually Jacob Lawrence, or, you know, actually Pollock, Roscoe, Alice Neal, they all got commissions to do murals, and art was somehow brought into society. I wanted to ask you, because it's something which you do public works, you do wall paintings. Can you tell us a little bit about that aspect, and if there are any projects you're working on in that direction?
Well, I did a lot of wall paintings also out of sheer necessity. I mean, there was actually a whole show I did in the FRAC in Auvergne, because there was a very young curator, but there was no money to bring over the paintings. So I decided to create a whole new show, which was temporarily and actually ephemeral because it was on the wall and then had to be disappeared, which is kind of an interesting idea, the way it works on your memory. Of course, there's some things that are fixed. I mean, there's the big mosaic in front of the Mas, which is a museum in Antwerp. There's also 2 wall paintings in the theater in Dresden. There's one at Jan Faber's repetition space, one in, I think, in Bruges in the opera, and there's one in the museum, which is a real fresco that I made about 2 years ago in the Museum of Fine Arts in Ghent. I mean, I think those are the ones that are existing, but I made much more. I made about 60 or 70 of those wall paintings out of this pragmatic situation, but also it gave me the idea to enlarge it and to give it a different type of immediacy. The very funny thing is that when I do these things, they are, I don't really care if there's about 100 people looking at it. I mean, it's very funny, the distinction between the studio and once you go into a public space. I found that very interesting. I mean, I don't care. I mean, it still goes back to a childhood memory when I was in the central station in Antwerp as a kid of 6 years old, drawing the central station, and a crowd of people was surrounding me. I couldn't care less. So this is a public thing that's, even in the making of it, is very different. Whereas in the studio, the intimacy is actually paramount. But I think these things are important to do, but they have to have a certain necessity, and they have to be done at the right time, at the right time. Like also the one I made for the Athenaeum in Antwerp, which was a place that was burned when it was restored. And the school director, this is a school with 62 nationalities. And this was the first non-religious school that was founded by Napoleon Bonaparte. So it's kind of an interesting historical thing. And so I made a specific painting for that situation, a specific wall painting for these things. They all have to sort of also, they create a different type of legacy, I think. They create a different way of how you exponentially actually project your visual into the world.
Thank you. Now, a project which goes also beyond the realm of the exhibition, out of a necessity or out of urgency, is a project you're working on for the European community. We discussed it actually in the context of another interview we did together at Villa Ampin, when Asad Raza and I did an exhibition, an homage to Edouard Glissant. And you've been actually collaborating with Georgi Conrad, with Pistoletto, with Barroso, with many others on a project to actually create culture as a European project. And the idea is, of course, also that there would be a larger exhibition at some point. It's a project which clearly goes beyond, an exhibition. It goes beyond curating. It's a kind of a project on the scale of Europe. Can you tell us about that?
Well, this came about I think now it's about 14 or 12 years ago, or even longer, I don't know, when we were invited by Barroso in the Berlaymont building. Then it was with Jorge Conrad, Rem Koolhaas, and with many more people, where we were asked to dream up a new narrative for Europe, to which we reacted in a very pragmatic way, in the sense that it's very strange that it comes in a very belated fashion, that then we were asked to, what can culture actually do for Europe, which is something they should have asked earlier. I mean, next to the technocratical program of the whole European community, as of course it's a commercial zone, which is important, there was never a big thought of the social cultural aspects of Europe. And I think they are very important if you want to create any form of identity or any form of, let's say, collaboration or solidarity within this continent. I think you need that specific feedback. And it's also important as a project for the future, because I think Europe is not great on resources, but it is very great in culture. And this is something that has to do immediately with our survival. And actually the pandemic will show that even more, because of the inconsistency that we cannot go to places that we want to visit and things like that. But we feel the loss instantaneously. Now, to put that in a more bigger consensus, this is also important because we have the means, the possibilities to work with a different speed and with a different assessment of what something could be, what is relevant or not. And all these discussions were actually played out, but they sort of got lost in the bureaucracy, which is a shame. I mean, it started out with a very, very, very good intention. And I still will continue that, because I think in that sense, besides being Belgium and having a nationality, it's important to actually go over the boundaries and actually also portray the situation of being part of a bigger thing, in a sense.
And you've, of course, throughout the interview already answered it on several occasions. My only recurrent question in all the interviews is about unrealized projects, because we know so much about architects' unrealized projects because they actually publish them, but we know very little about artists' unrealized projects. And as you know, I've always been interested in unrealized projects. There can be projects which are too big to be realized or too small to be realized. Sometimes it's also just forgotten projects. Sometimes with public art, it's lost competition entries. Sometimes it's utopias, utopic projects, some concrete utopias, some unrealizable utopias. There is, of course, also censored projects. And as Doris Lessing always told me in our conversation, she always said there is also the projects we simply haven't dared to do yet. So there's a whole range of the unrealized. Are there any additional unrealized projects you haven't mentioned yet you could tell us about?
Well, the one we talked about already is the Kerry James situation, which is an unrealized project. But really what's still deep down in my belly is that when there was a film project that actually I started that never finished. And this is still something that is actually there. I mean, as a reminiscence, as an old pain, so to speak. And I hope, because this is also teamwork, I think, in some time in the future, maybe to get back to that, to make an assessment, because film has been quite the predominant element in the work. But as I said, it's kind of, it's very difficult to combine. So if I would do that, I would take time off and have to really concentrate on it fully, in a sense. But it's still something that is unrealized and still there to work with how that would actually play out. And the other thing that will probably not be real, we could not actually realize that, is I would be very enamored to go through a show of my own work and not knowing that I made it, so that I could be able to look at it as somebody who is either utterly demented, or to look at it in a certain type of innocence that we have all lost.
Luc, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hans Ulrich, and thank you, Luc. That was a wonderful journey with many paths through the past and through the current show that we have in Hong Kong. I know that many of us will not be able to see the exhibition in person. So we have created a wonderful website, expanded website with installation images for people to visit coming this Monday. We have also included 2 interviews with other artists, including Kerry James, Marshall, and Lu Ye. But again, thank you, Hans Ulrich, for your thoughtful and very topical questions. And thank you, Luc, for showing us that your work has always and will be relevant to our society today. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.